What does the future of EVs in Australia look like?
And how could Telstra's latest tablet experiment change the way vision impaired people watch sport? Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.
Hi there. Welcome back to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the tech podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading tech journalists to dive into the big stories of the week. I'm your host, Alex Kidman, and alongside me sits the one and only Adam Turner. Hey, Adam, apparently the hot new trend for product launches is, and if PR people aren't lying to me, I'm not making this up, to offer attendees a brand tattoo. Now, I think that's a terrible idea. I'm not against tattoos, but I think it's a terrible idea. But what tech brand logo would be the worst, do you think, to have indelibly marked on your body?
Well, that was my first question. Like, did you mean like a cattle brand, or do you mean literally getting the Apple logo tattooed on my ass? You
The
mean the
latter, I
latter. All
believe.
right.
Yeah.
Um, None of them would be a good choice, but probably the Facebook tattoo, because they'd slip in some kind of tracking device while they were doing it, and I don't need that.
And they change the privacy on it all the time.
Oh
So
yeah,
you'd have
yeah,
to
and
keep
you'd
clicking
never
it.
know who was looking at your ass because they'd always make it open to the public.
We're also joined by a new guest on Vertical Hold from Gizmodo Australia. It's Zach Kelly. Welcome to the show, Zach.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Zach, if you had to get a tech brand as your tattoo of choice, what tech brand would it be and why?
I think it would be easy to say no to a lot of them, but I would probably get something a bit gamery. Maybe the Assassin's Creed logo. That'd be nice on his shoulder.
It's reasonably subtle as well. Like that's not one like like a Facebook logo or whatever, where at least you can kind of go, no, it's just an artistic design. I like the way you
Yeah.
think.
And if something controversial happens with the company, then you have to sort of justify like, oh, why do you have a Tesla logo on your shoulder? Oh, I thought it was cool at the time.
Yeah, it's like getting an ex-girlfriend's tattoo name removed, or at least changing it to something else.
I'm sure there's a bunch of
It's
Tesla tats
it's
out there.
it's
Actually,
it's not Tesla, it's Telstra.
Yeah, because that's so much better.
Oh yeah, that will impress people. And speaking of impressing people, Zach does a lot of really impressive work over at Gizmodo in the EV space. And we're going to dive into what's hot in EVs, what's coming, and what's really important directly. But first, Telstra has a new tablet. And look, it's not just some new iPad so that Apple can get a little bit richer. Instead, it's an assistive tech device called the 5G Touch and Track. Now, Zach, you've been across this story. What makes this a very different tablet experience?
Well, I guess what makes the Telstra 5G Touch and Track different, firstly, it's a prototype, so it might completely change further down the line. But what makes it really different is that it's got this focus on tactile feedback. There's no screen on the thing. The difference between it and an iPad is mostly the interaction. Instead of relying on the visuals of an iPad or a Galaxy Tab, you rely on the physical feedback that you feel in your fingertips by touching it.
So it's like a digital braille experience, sort of.
Sort of. It's basically in its current form catering entirely to AFL, where the translations of the game are fed into into the tablet so that they can be understood by people who are blind.
So, what are they reading it, or does it feel like the ground? Like, what's their experience?
Their experience varies depending on what's going on with the tablet. So one of its main features is it has this sort of movable magnetic ring that moves around and indicates where the ball is on the field. And depending on which team has the ball, it rumbles differently. If there's a goal, it rumbles in a special way. If it switches teams, it rumbles in a different way. So it has these not these visual cues. It has these like physical cues that keep you involved in the game in a way that people who are blind could understand without having to rely entirely on the sound of the event.
So the tablet's laid out like a football ground, so they can feel the thing moving from the forward line to the back line, back over to the wing. They can sort of feel what's going on.
Pretty much, yeah. And it's about the size of an iPad too. So they can feel this thing just sitting at the game.
So is the idea here, and the regular listeners will know I'm not a sports guy, but is the idea here that they're then throwing a similar 5G transmitter into the ball, or are they just relying on like machine learning and camera angles to try and work out where it might be? Because even with AFL, I can imagine there's probably a few points where it's not exactly clear where the ball might be, or it might be running a little bit behind, for example, a commentary that a blind sports fan might be listening to.
Mm. I think one of the more important things to stress about this is that, like, not only is it a prototype, but it's also not, like, Telstra's not saying it's a complete experience. Like,
Mm.
they're saying that it's complementary to someone who is blind listening to the audio. But I can imagine it working over 5G and having the inputs translated over 5G by tracking the ball with cameras. I can see that happening, but Telstra's been a bit tight-lipped on the tech behind making this thing work.
I would imagine lag would be the killer here, and I partly imagine that part of the reason why Telstra's doing this is to just find uses for 5G to show off the low latency and what you can actually do with it. But I would imagine anybody who's vision impaired at the football is listening to the radio broadcast, which is maybe about half a second or so behind the play. Not so much that it's really a problem, especially for them because they can't actually see what's happening. But if there was any lag again, if this board lagged a second behind the radio coverage, I would imagine that would be more distracting than anything else. So they're really going to have to work tightly to sync it all up.
Yeah, for sure. I can imagine one of the more difficult things about this definitely being the latency.
Hmm.
Imagine if you're feeling it and the ball is on one side of the field, and then you hear everybody around you really excited about a goal that was just scored, and you're still tracking the ball from about 30, 40 seconds ago. It could be bad, but uh I can imagine it being quite effective if done correctly, if done quite locally within a football stadium. You know, especially if mmWave 5G was used, that
Hmm.
could enhance the speed of the latency.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And actually, Adam, your example of the radio actually makes me wonder if you might not even end up with the reverse. If the radio's running a bit behind, you might think, well, hang on, the ball seems to be up one end of the field, which would indicate someone's done something with it, but they're still talking about the other team having it.
True. Oh,
Mm.
the lag with the radio is very short. Like if it quickly goes from person to person to person, the radio can be a little bit behind, but it's almost like the commentators allow for that because they talk as if who's just had it or what's going on. They don't try and tell you every single thing that's going on. They try and tell you the highlights, if you know what I mean. So it doesn't matter so much there's that tiny lag, but I guess the real test for this, and like to me, this is a bit of a personal thing because my father-in-law lost his vision in his last few years, and so my family's got a bit of first-hand experience with this kind of technology, and I've seen how he worked with that kind of technology, and I would imagine the test for him would have been: is this going to enhance the experience, or is this going to disrupt the experience? Is it going to make it better to be at the football, or is it just going to be annoying and get in the way? And I would assume that would be the test that anyone would apply to it.
I guess one of the more uh, important things, obviously, it is again a prototype, but obviously too, it's not necessary to enjoy the football. You can still enjoy the football quite a lot by listening along.
Hmm.
It's just as it's in the prototype phase, it's trying to enhance the experience,
Yeah.
and Telstra seems to be quite proactive about doing this. You know, they've had a lot of they've been working with a lot of interested parties like, you know, AFL Blind and Field
Right.
of Vision to try and get this to work as best as possible. It'll be interesting to see how different the marketable version is from the prototype though.
I love the fact that they're doing this though, because it's all too often
Hmm.
we talk about a new technology, we talk about a new phone or a new gadget, and it's the newest one, it's the fastest one, it just does things better than the last one did. This is taking a technology which here on the show we've talked about 5G for years and saying, right, here is a practical use case for that low latency of 5G, where I can very much see how 4G could really wreck this experience. It's not for me, obviously, but I love the fact that it exists and that they're at least thinking about it.
Mm. It's always nice to get this kind of proactive positivity, like this kind of innovation, really giving us a good example of a tech like 5G.
So EVs are said to be the future of motoring. It seems you can't really go more than a day or two without somebody mentioning EVs in some aspect of the Australian lifestyle. But at the same time, as most tech people will know, we lag behind really, really badly in the EV space. Zach, I know you've been doing a lot of writing on EVs for Gizmodo of late, and I wanted to touch on a bunch of things that you've written about and your perspectives on the market in general. One story which really jumped out at me that you've written recently was about a magnetic motor that UNSW has been developing. Because when we talk about EVs, a lot of people just think, oh, these are all these things, they're all developed overseas. Maybe we're mining some of the raw materials, but that's about all Australia has in the EV space. It's not true, is it?
Australia definitely has a lot of raw materials to contribute to the EV space, but our uptake of EVs is not great. And even if we have a lot of the materials, we're still going to need innovations like this one at UNSW that cuts down on the rare earth elements required to build the motors. Like there is not enough lithium in the world to keep making millions and millions of EVs for years and years and years on end, right?
I
So,
would imagine that some people are getting very rich from rare earth materials, and I wouldn't be surprised if this invention gets buried.
There's definitely a lot of opportunities and there's definitely a lot of concerns about it getting
Mm.
buried, especially by big oil and stuff. But it's it's something that we're going to need to start thinking about quite a lot, especially as we shift to EVs, right? Like this is part of the reason people get so excited about hydrogen. Some people like to think hydrogen is the next step from EVs because of the lower reliance on lithium ion. But obviously all tech is transitional, right?
yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know that this thing would get buried simply because whilst it's got some disruptive potential in terms of, as you say, Adam, the kind of the value of lithium, it's also got that transformative ability to say, well, actually, here's how we can make a more efficient motor. Here's how potentially we can either make for either end of the market, either a much nicer or faster EV supercar, because there's definitely people who like those, or a much cheaper, simpler thing because we can make it with fewer of these materials. It feels like a bit of a win-win that's just waiting, for the patent ink to dry.
So, Zach, it seems like we're not short of expensive EV supercars, though. Is it? Are we seeing enough? And I know it's tricky in Australia, but just generally in the world, are we seeing enough EVs coming in for reasonable people to want to buy for a reasonable price to drive to the shops?
No. It is something that I am really excited to see change, frankly. But for the moment, even the cheap EVs that we don't have in Australia right now would cost about $42,000 here if they were to come here,
Mm.
translated from like pounds. There aren't many cheap EVs, and the cheapest ones in Australia idle around the $45,000 point. And there's a lot of reasons for that, mostly surrounding it still being an emerging technology. Um, but it's still quite out of reach from most people.
I mean, there are cheap EVs. I'm going to argue with you here, Zach, because there are cheap EVs coming out of, for example, China, except they're not really coming out of China. They're being built in China for their domestic market. Now, some of them are definitively on the cheap and nasty side. If you want to buy a death trap that's probably not legal on our roads, you can order these terrible, terrible machines on
On
AliExpress.
Alibaba?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. There are those, but there are actual reputable makes and models doing cheaper things in those spaces, and even a few European very small cars. But this is one of those things that annoys me in the EV discussion. And actually, Zach, I'd be really interested in your perspective on this. So much of it in the Australian space goes on range anxiety, goes on, oh, I need to be able to do my 1,000 kilometre trip, and if I can't, an EV is totally useless. But you look at the numbers, the average Australian car does like 30K a day. It's tiny. And the average Australian person lives in a city or a large metropolitan area doing those 30Ks. These smaller cars are not necessarily an impediment to that, in my view.
No. Even a lot of plug-in hybrid batteries are well within that 30-36
Mm.
kilometer range that most Australians might do on the daily. But yeah, this idea of range anxiety, we've really grandfathered it since 2019, right? Like the whole end the weekend thing, right? But it's not really a concern. I've driven hundreds and hundreds of kilometers in review EVs and always gotten within range of a fast charger. It's just difficult for a few reasons, particularly around charging speed now. I personally think the problem with charging is not really like the amount of range you have, it's how fast it takes to get there, you know? How fast it takes you to get the battery charged.
That's the question that I was going to ask because I don't have range anxiety, and most of the time I might only be driving it to the shops. But occasionally I'm going to want to drive to the country. I'm going to want to drive interstate. Now I checked and it's a 9 hour drive to Sydney. They must have put in a few bypasses because the last time I drove to Sydney was closer to 11. But a 9 hour drive to Sydney, I would imagine would still be maybe 3 tanks of petrol, right? Now, if the range on my EV is 300 or 400 kilometers, I'm going to have to stop once or twice. How many hours am I going to sit there? Is my 9 hour trip suddenly become 18 hours because I've needed to make 2 6 hour stopovers to the numbers don't add up there, but you know what I mean. If I had to stop for hours,
You're in Brisbane. Hey, Adam.
no, I'm in Melbourne.
Melbourne, sorry.
Yes.
Okay. I actually crunched these numbers the other day because I was planning an EV trip in the new MG to go to Brisbane. Um, and if I was to take that car, I would on the way up stop 3 or 4 times to recharge it, and there would be enough charges. But I would be charging to get to 80 or 90%. I would be sitting there for an hour, provided the charging was capable of 80 kilowatt hour charging speed.
Is
As
that
opposed to
but
10 minutes
is
to
that an
refill the gas
hour?
tank.
Is that an hour all up or an hour per charge? Because certainly
An
the
hour per
experience.
charge.
Ooh,
Okay, so
Yeah.
that's a hard
that's the
sell.
MG, and this does vary. And Adam, to get to your example, this is exactly what I am going to do when I come down to do our PAX show.
Yeah.
So I will be driving Sydney to Melbourne in a Tesla Model 3.
Oh,
And
so
for
not your little Leaf.
no. Not the Leaf. The Tesla has a better range. And Tesla has an advantage, and this is undeniably a big part of the reason why they've been able to sell a fair few more cars locally. Their charging network is a fair bit quicker. And it's why I was asking you, Zach, if that was an hour all up, because I will take, by my estimates, maybe an hour, but that includes lunch breaks. That includes stop breaks. People have done this, Adam. The listeners can go onto YouTube. There's a bunch of people who have done, especially Sydney to Melbourne seems very, very popular. Um, and they've done literally the same petrol and equivalent EV model of car, and the timing difference was something in the region of about 15 minutes.
How
Which
is that possible? Because it only takes 15 minutes to refill your tank of petrol and keep driving, as opposed to an hour to recharge the battery.
because you're not taking because this is not every single vehicle and every single charger. It does depend, as Zach was saying, it depends on the speed of the
Oh, so
charger.
best
So
case
some of them are
scenario.
faster. Yeah,
Yeah.
some of them are faster than others. I would say the other challenge here for that country driving scenario, and any EV driver I think would agree with me, you have to plan ahead. You have to kind of know, right, there's a
Mm.
charger here, there's a charger there, is the availability and number. So I have done a bunch of country-based EV driving. It's totally doable, but there have been instances where you'll get to a charger, and again, Tesla has a bit of an advantage here because they've spent money doing it. But you'll get to a charger and you'll discover there's someone already there, and then you've got to
Ooh.
wait.
Yeah,
Mm.
that'd
So
suck.
that is a challenge. That is undeniably a challenge, albeit one again. There's work being done on this. Yeah.
That's one of my main criticisms of EVs. Once we reach that critical mass point with electric car uptake, we are going to start having to assess how our charging infrastructure is sort of laid out. How we handle it most times now is it's 2 stations, one for one car park each, one for
Hmm.
one like car spot each. And that's fine for right now for most places. For example, the charging spot I tend to use quite a lot with my reviews, the Tari EVIE charger, EV
Hmm.
charger. Um, that's a 350 kilowatt charger. It's really fast. But of course, that's limited to how fast the car can charge. That one only has 2 car spots. And if there was going to be a lot of EVs passing through that area, obviously you'd be parked up for ages
Hmm.
waiting to get a charge. And these charges might take like 15, 30 minutes to get like a 80, 90% charge.
Yeah, and it is that, I guess it is something that where we can actually draw from best example internationally, because the one advantage you've got with an EV, of course, is you don't actually need a big tub to hold all the gasoline underneath the service station. You just need an available power source. Now, this is not a non-trivial problem, but the point is, power is sort of everywhere. So you've still got that kind of confidence thing. I mean, just recently, I think it's in this week, two guys driving Teslas from Perth have just done inverted loops of the country. They've circumnavigated the entire country, one going north, one going south. And one of them managed to do the whole thing in 14 days.
Wow.
And that's a big, big distance. I wouldn't want to say that I would do that thing in 14 days, just, flat in a petrol car. So it is a manageable problem for now, and it's something where we do need to put work in. But this actually brings me around to a question that one of our listeners asked us, which was about inner city charging infrastructure, because there's this assumption, and it is a benefit in a way of the EV model, that when you're at home. So Adam, if you had an EV, I know you've got a garage. You park it in there, you charge it overnight.
You haven't seen my garage. There's no
But-
park. There's no cars being parked in my garage. But please continue.
But okay, we chuck out all
All
of
the
your
crap.
AFL merch and all of your crap, and then we park the car in there. The point is, it doesn't matter then how fast your car is charging, because your 30k you can recharge off any standard power point easily overnight. You'll never feel the sides of it. But for inner city dwellers, for apartment dwellers, they of course don't necessarily have that. Body corporates are not particularly keen on the idea of spending money on putting it in. Zach, do you know anything that's being done around this issue of city charging?
Yeah, one of the more interesting things that's happening is Arena, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. They're funding a project to trial inner city charging stations on power poles. So where it might be impractical to park a car closer to a power point or closer to or in a garage, like in those condensed inner city suburbs, you can pull up to these charging poles and plug your car in, jot it down on the app, and charge your car up. Now, this is just being trialed, but it does sort of provide an interesting solution to that problem.
That's certainly something that's done overseas. I mean, it's been, pandemic, thanks. It's been a couple of years since I've traveled internationally, but I can recall the last time I was in Paris, a whole bunch of I think they were actually just the parking meters, were also EV chargers. It was literally just pull up, pay for your parking, potentially pay for your power, walk off to buy your baguette, and and refuel while you're doing it. It's a bit of a win-win as long as you can get it happening, of course.
Yeah, and I'm a pretty big fan of it as a concept, but and it's definitely better than the worst case scenario where you're running an extension cord out of the front of your house to charge your car.
One of my concerns with EVs is that they typically seem to be quite small, like Alex's Leaf. Now, if I'm replacing a car, I want a car with a decent boot size, at least until my kids move out. It doesn't necessarily have to be a big gas guzzling giant, but I don't want a small compact car. Now, I don't think that makes me a bad person, and I don't think that makes me out of the
Other
ordinary at
things
all.
make you a bad person.
Yeah, and
Adam.
other things do, but that's a different podcast. But I was actually interested when I was looking at some of the articles you've written about the new EVs that have come out here recently. There were two of and these were the cheaper, so like the $45,000 ones, the BYD Atto 3 and the MGZ SEV Excite. Both look like reasonable size SUVs with a bit of boot space, but they're not like 80, 90 grand. Are we seeing that more of getting a bigger car at a more affordable price?
I think with the MG and the BYD, it's this interesting case where they're trying to sell a technology that is quite expensive right now. And part of the interest that they want to generate is they want to try and appeal to as many people as possible with the extra product that the car is, and that's an SUV. And
Mm.
it's a small, both of them, they're small medium SUVs. They're quite nicely sized actually.
Well,
They
just for a comparison, I've got a Captiva.
Mhm.
Would it be as big as a Captiva? Oh,
Captiva.
Holden Captiva. So that's got a reasonable sized boot, and or you can flip up the
I'm
two
gonna,
seats in the
I'm
boot
gonna,
to
I'd
I'm
seat
gonna
say
say
seven.
no. I'm gonna say no.
I'd say
But
smaller.
Yeah,
yeah,
I would imagine it'd be a bit smaller than that.
but then I'd also defend my Leaf. That thing has more space than you might think. It's not.
Yeah,
It is not
Um,
your absolute super compact little hatch. That thing.
yeah.
Um, there's actually a side discussion to have here as well because we didn't get onto this when we were talking about pricing because this is the other way, and I will put my hand up and say, yeah, obviously I've done it, but a reasonable number of other people have. The other way we're seeing these cars come into market is lots of predominantly Japanese imports coming in at between like 20 to 30K as second hand.
Would you buy a secondhand EV? What are the risks of buying a secondhand EV?
one of the risks of buying a secondhand EV, definitely one of the things you have to consider is the battery, right?
Mm.
Hmm.
If the car is more than 5, 10 years old, it's definitely something that you should keep in mind. You might not notice it, but you might, right? um, the good news is that obviously you can get the battery replaced, and if the car manufacturer doesn't want to do it, you can get it done through specialized mechanics.
This
But
is
it's
trick.
usually quite expensive.
Well, this is tricky. More, it's not cheap. You're not wrong. This is tricky more in Australia simply because the available models. The Leaf is pretty much the model that people have done this with. The available models generally, when they do those kind of replacements in Europe, for example, where they've sold a lot of them, come from crashed or otherwise written off vehicles. Whereas here in Australia, there's just not that many of them. And in fact, Zach, you wrote a piece on how Nissan itself is using expired or expiring Leaf batteries in a different way as well. So that would reduce the stock even more. There is some work out in New Zealand being done in replacement batteries though as well.
Yeah, Nissan's actually this is their latest in a range of similar projects that it's done overseas, but they're working with an Australian company called Relectrify. They're based in Melbourne on transforming 9 used Nissan Leaf batteries into basically a power wall, basically a giant battery for one of their facilities in Melbourne. And it's a really good idea. These batteries have been used and had their best worn out of them. But what a company like Electrify does is they come in and they sort of refurbish them so that they can be used as stationary batteries. It's really remarkable.
So I've never bought a new car in my life. And I kind of just assumed I never would because I don't have a lot of money to spend on a cars and I'm not really a car guy. I'm happy to, spend a shed load of money on a good television because I'm a television guy. So I would maybe the last car I bought it was a secondhand Captiva. It was about $20,000, which is probably the most I've ever spent on a car. It was maybe 5 years old, and I want to get 7 or 8 years out of it at least before I replace it. So when you extrapolate that out, if I was buying a new car and I was paying 40 something, which to me sounds like a shitload of money, but you could tell me I could get 10 to 15 years out of it. I'm like, well, okay, I guess that sort of stacks up. Is that feasible to think, okay, I'll spend $45,000 on the MG ZS EVX side or something like that? Is it going to last me 10 or 15 years? I mean, I know apart from battery problems.
It's this interesting rethinking of like cars as a sales pitch, right? Like
Hmm.
when the iPhone came out, many but phone buyers weren't considering spending that much on a personal phone,
Hmm.
right? And now that the Tesla's out, many people are buying their first new car for the first time, right? Even though that thing is really expensive,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And what we saw in Australia when the Model Y came out, the newest Tesla, many Model 3 buyers, these are Tesla cars, went on to secondhand their Model 3s to buy the Model Y. So there's definitely a lot of interest to get the hottest new thing. But in terms of these things lasting, it's pretty fair to expect the battery to last, and if it doesn't, then it would be fair to expect it to be replaceable under the warranty. That's what I would say. But It's obviously still emerging tech, right? And this is still developing.
The
But
devil
if
is in the detail with a lot of this stuff. So
Mm,
Tesla, for example, I'm fairly sure off the top of my head, I think they do an 8-year warranty on the battery. Obviously, Australian consumer law would probably have something to say there as well because of the higher cost of those vehicles. Whereas BYD, I know there's been a bit of concern with their vehicle, the Atto 3, because they've set up this very specific warranty schedule. And I cannot remember how many years they've said the battery's good for, but they've basically said you have to have it serviced quite a bit, which is one of your other
it's
technical
expensive.
advantages with an EV. You generally don't have to do the same level of servicing, and of course, you can balance that power of electricity, cost of electricity, um, against cost of petrol thing to further lower, Adam, to get into your corporate world, the total cost of ownership.
Yes.
I would actually consider it to be a bit of a double-edged sword, the cost of servicing, because many car owners probably would not want to pay as much as the servicing cost for an EV would be anyway, right? And a lot of car owners would probably be fine with doing the servicing themselves as well. Um, with EVs, that's a lot more difficult, and it's also a lot more expensive. And on top of that, there's a lot of third-party mechanics that don't really have a lot of experience with EVs yet.
Mm.
This is a challenge, definitely. I've been able to get my Leaf serviced, but it took me a fair dig around to find
Mm,
someone. Although it was way cheaper than getting the car that it replaced serviced, so it can be done.
mm.
So the last time I sat down to have a look at EVs, like I said, I all I could see at the time were pretty small cars. And then I thought about hybrids as an alternative because from what I can see, hybrids maybe tend to be a little bit cheaper and tend to be a bit bigger, more closer to the size that I want. And because they've been around for a while, maybe I could get one secondhand. I don't know. How does a hybrid stack up against an EV, both from a like value for money kind of perspective and also just like an environmental perspective?
In terms of value for money, they definitely do what you want them to do, right? They are still a petrol consuming car that will get you from A to B without much worry about range anxiety, right? In terms of the environment, though, it largely comes down to the person driving it. If we're talking about a plug in hybrid, for example, which is becoming the more dominant version of hybrids, um, it the electrification of that vehicle largely relies on how the driver handles it. So they might be lazy and not plug it in often and rely on the generator inside that car generating the petrol and turning it into battery power. And that is not environmentally friendly, and that goes against the entire point,
Hmm.
Mm,
right? But if you're a standard hybrid owner, just a plain hybrid, the electricity in that is usually to just add extra power, and that
Hmm.
it's not. There's not much of an environmental argument to be made there. It's marginally better, if anything.
It's
But
yeah.
so when you
yeah,
say a plain hybrid, you
yeah,
mean that doesn't have to be plugged into the wall?
a lot of them don't actually have the
Where do they
plug-in
get the power from then?
They
from the
generate it
petrol.
from the petrol. It's just the energy that you would get from burning petrol instead of going to a series of pistons and so on. Your
Oh,
standard
I
traditional combustion
misunderstood
engine.
that.
It goes into a battery, which then drives,
Yeah,
I
your
thought
motor.
they were using the ones that didn't plug into the wall were using, is it regenerative braking or what, like when you slow down, putting
Regen
power
braking
back
is a
into
different thing.
some of
But
them
yeah,
have regen braking, but regen braking is largely a thing that EVs have, as far as I'm aware. I might be
it's a
wrong.
general. Yeah, that's Adam. That's a general kind of principle thing. For me, the hybrid thing feels like a worst of both worlds thing.
Hmm,
Because you're reaching for this slightly better environmental principle, but you're not quite getting there. You're also then taking on the worst of all servicing cost scenarios because you've got the EV battery there, but you've also still got the petrol engine, which has to be maintained and serviced on
yeah.
a much more regular basis. I get why people are buying them. I do understand it, but it doesn't feel like quite the right step. But while we're talking about charging, the one thing Australia doesn't have a whole lot of EVs, but the one thing that Australia does have is a whole lot of sun. Where are we at with solar and EVs, Zach?
There aren't a lot of solar powered cars right now.
Hmm.
One of the more interesting ones comes from the Netherlands. It's called the Lightyear Zero, and it is this incredible looking sports car, and there's solar panels all across it, and it's got this expected range of near 1,000 kilometers, and it is absolutely ludicrously expensive. It is like if it was to be sold in Australia, it would be over $350,000. So when we look at it like that, it's still very much far away based on price alone. However, if we look at it at more of a condensed level, obviously the price of rooftop solar has come down
Mm.
quite a lot over the past 20 years, and Australia's been a world leader on adopting rooftop solar. So if we sort of saw it like that, that the price could come down if we were to start using it more and more, that's pretty healthy. And there was this really interesting, I'm trying to find it now.
Well,
Um, yeah.
what you do? There's an interesting counterexample to this. A thing called I think it's the Sono Scion,
Mm.
which is a German car, which I love for two reasons. One, it has moss growing in the dash deliberately, and two, I'm not making that up. And two, it is completely or designed to be completely solar powered, but as a cheap little affordable thing. This thing just looks like a regular hatch. Adam, you'd probably hate it. You'd think it was too small, but it looks like an absolutely regular hatch.
As long
And
as it
then,
looks like a normal car, because that's what I
yeah,
was
yeah,
going to say. I think your average person does not want a car covered in solar panels because it would look ugly. But I also imagine if you had a smash, it'd be a lot more complicated and expensive to repair if you've also stuffed up the solar panels on the back of the car.
It definitely it 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 definitely adds a layer of complexity, but there was this recent bit of news that came out of Newcastle University. There's this Tesla driving around Australia right now,
mm.
powered by printed solar, and those are solar panels that have actually come out of a printer and are relying on like ink to be powered. And I'm trying to find the figure now. It was something like $10 to produce a square meter of these solar panels, and that is absolutely remarkable for something that can be quite easily recycled.
And but the idea there, I think, if I'm thinking of the right story, Zach, and forgive me if I'm wrong, I think the idea there was that this was the emergency printed roll you'd have in the boot,
That's right.
and then if you did find yourself in the literal middle of nowhere in the desert, you just go right. Well, I'm just going to kick back here with the car for an hour or two, or a bit longer, because solar charging is slow. I will admit that, and I'll get enough to then get me to the next place, which actually has proper power.
Mm. But I guess what I'm trying to say is these technologies are scalable, right?
Yeah,
And I don't think there's as much enthusiasm around solar powered cars as I wish there was. I think that if there was more, we would start to see more innovations like the Lightyear, like the Scion, and like these paper solar panels really starting to come into fruition for EVs.
That raises an interesting issue for the bigger picture. Because if you're trying to crunch the numbers, I think a lot of people would be like me. I like to do the right thing, but I don't have the money where I can just go and get this stuff because it's new and it will save the environment. It's got to work within my finances. And I'm not going to go out and get a car loan for an $80,000 Tesla or
mm.
whatever, right? So once it works within my budget, I'm happy to do it, but I'm not going to put myself into ridiculous debt for it. Now you've got a few different things. If you're thinking, okay, I want to be a bit more environmentally friendly, there's a couple of things you can do. You can think about putting solar panels on your roof. You can think about putting a battery in your house, which I imagine must come after the solar panels. And you can think about an electric vehicle. Now, each time you get one, it changes the value proposition of the other.
Yep.
Solar panels seems to me pretty much a no-brainer. I got mine. They halved my power bill and paid for themselves in about 3 years. That no problem with that. But a battery, an in-house battery, would take a lot longer. Then there's the alternative of, well, should I spend that instead of putting the money on a battery? Should I put the money on the car? And then there's this whole idea with some cars are actually two-way charging, so you can plug the car into the house and use the car as the battery for the house. But then if I just wasted the money on getting a battery for the house, do you know what I mean? If you're sitting there looking at all these things, thinking, what's the best thing where am I going to get my best bang for the buck at this time and then move on? How would you approach it?
I think it's difficult for a lot of people right now, especially while EVs in general are just so out of reach from so many
Mm.
people. The good news is that there's subsidies for a lot of this
Mm.
stuff. They're not massive, but they're still available to some people. And depending on the state that you're living in, you can get several $1,000s shaved off the price of an electric car, for example. But it's difficult to tell it's difficult to tell what the best place to start is, and I think it's something that changes from person to person, from lifestyle to lifestyle.
Yeah. I would
I
imagine
think it's
from
especially different and difficult, much more difficult if you're a renter, for
oh,
example, like me.
absolutely. I think they are trying to do more deals and government policies where it's easier for renters to get solar or for people who have rental properties to have solar. But if if it's not a problem getting the panels put on your roof, then that seems to me to be the best value for money and the best place to start. But then that changes the economics of the other things that you do after it.
Well, I've got two observations on that, and I'm not disagreeing at all. Actually, the solar, of course, can work very nicely with an EV because at that point, depending on your usage and where you're able to park the car, but especially if you, for example, work from home or can work from home
But most
sometimes,
people
or
don't.
but even if you just have the car parked on the at the weekend, you can do a reasonable quantity of charging of the car, at which point you are not necessarily paying for the power to charge the car. Your fuel bills go down. That being said, every single economic analysis suggests that car ownership is a really, really bad idea. If you're talking about just saving the bottom line, don't own a car at all. Use public transport. I mean, I like my EVs, but I recognize that they are an absolute monetary choice and that the smarter thing for the vast majority of people to do, and lots of people do not want to do this. I'm sure plenty of listeners are going, but I love my car. I'm not getting on no stinking bus or train or catching a cab or whatever. But economically, anytime anyone has ever crunched the numbers, the smartest thing you can do is use public transport, save that money, put it into even a low interest account, and you will come out ahead.
I'll address that really quickly, but
Mm,
Adam, you were completely correct about the regenerative braking thing. I looked it up, and yeah, it's regenerative braking and combustion engine fuel
mm.
turning into
Okay.
battery power. So
Yeah.
Yep.
we were both right. Yeah, I'm a call me a bleeding heart lefty, right? But I'm a big fan of livable, walkable cities, right?
Yay.
I look at a
You
place
live
like
in the wrong country.
We all do in that
well,
sense, but yes.
I look at a country like Amsterdam, 50 years ago,
Mm,
it was, street to street car, like banked
mm.
up traffic. And now you look at it and it's like bicycles. It's a really functional city with low emissions. It's really incredible what they've managed to do in half a century. And I think that a lot of people seem to envision EVs with this rosy idea of, we're gonna make the world greener, but even EVs aren't completely clean. They use
Mm.
tons of lithium ion. They use tons of rare earth elements, and you know, obviously we're never gonna completely cut out mining for the minerals that we absolutely need, but EVs aren't the most perfect solution.
They're just
Less consumption is always better than more
Mm.
consumption, right?
yeah, I think, and this is one of those things that I think a lot of fervent anti I will never drive an EV people tend to bring up. Oh, they use rare earth minerals, they're terrible for the environment, they're not recyclable. These things, though, are not true. I
Mm,
think the point to make here is that an EV, if we are just talking cars, if you have to have a car, when you look at the environmental impact of a combustion engine versus an EV, the EV comes out on top. The EV is still doing things to the world because it's doing things to the world, but until we freeze ourselves into a block at 0 degrees Kelvin, we're always going to be doing something to the world. We're always going to be making a change.
there
The
is a sizable counterpoint to that, and
mm,
that's the energy generated by the grid. In Australia,
mm.
for example, obviously most of our energy comes from fossil fuels, and most EV owners, when they plug in, if we connect the dots there, most of their energy is coming from fossil fuels. If we just connect the dots really closely there. And there is a point in that equation where we would start to see EVs definitely being better for the environment. Like, definitely in local environments, like inner cities, there's less pollution to be made, right? If everybody was driving an EV in Sydney, you'd never see smog again, right? Well, I don't know about that, but
You'd see
yeah,
less.
Yeah.
you'd see
It would
less.
reduce. It would reduce. And look again, and I don't have the figures to hand, but I've certainly seen and read the suggestion though that when you bear in mind that for a petrol vehicle, yes, you're not necessarily relying on a coal-fired burning station, and I do take your point there, and you're not entirely wrong. Um, you still, for example, have to have power to not only provide it at a pump, pumps are not hand cranked. After all, they actually run on electricity themselves, but also for their distribution. The actual distribution of petrol is a fairly energy intensive, fairly dirty business in itself, which gets us back to that point of, look, cars are not the cleanest things for the planet, and maybe a pair of sandals for everyone would be better.
Are we going to run into? Oh, well, just quickly, the
Yep.
problem in Australia is we build cities which force people to own cars.
True. Yeah.
Yes, and
Yeah.
we did,
And we don't invest
that's
enough in
such a
public.
hard to.
In,
We don't.
in
Yeah,
yeah, public
and when
transport.
we do, the
Absolutely.
public transport doesn't stretch out far enough. So we create two-tier cities. There's the
Uh-huh.
lucky few who live in the inner suburbs who have access to more public transport than they want, and there's the ones who live on the outer, where basically everyone over 18 in every household has to have a car if they want to get anywhere, and it's ridiculous. But that's not the point I was going to make. The point is, is the economics also going to change because as other nations start to phase out the sale of petrol cars, are we going to become, or are we already becoming, a dumping ground for petrol cars, which will then make them cheaper, which will then make the economics of buying an EV worse again? Because even though the EVs got cheaper, it's still X amount bigger than buying one of these discounted petrol cars that Toyota's trying to get rid of because they can't bloody sell it anywhere else.
Yeah, this is actually what a lot of EV advocates sort of argue right now. We are kind of being a dumping ground for
Mm.
petrol and a lot of less efficient hybrids because we lack this thing that a lot of other markets um, have called fuel efficiency standards. And what these standards do is they basically um, they kind of place a limit on automakers for how many um how many ICE vehicles they can sell without paying a sort of credit. That's a really, really generalized way of describing it, but it
They get
basically,
penalised for selling particularly dirty cars. I
yeah,
suppose.
Okay.
Yeah.
these automakers, they basically get incentivized to make EVs, and
Yeah.
that's why a lot of EV sales have been really successful in Europe because they have incredibly strong fuel efficiency standards. Japan doesn't have fuel efficiency standards quite as strong as Europe, neither does the US, but Europe's kind of been the gold standard as far as that's
Hmm.
considered, and we are seeing the uptake over there being quite great.
I would imagine that would involve having leadership of the country that wasn't literally in love with coal. Like parades it
Definitely.
around in Parliament and kisses it. Now,
The
now that we've seen a change in government in Australia, are we getting any indications that we're going to start to move down that path? That things are going to start to change? Because we all know what was holding back the electric car in Australia. It was the stonecutters and it was the Liberals or the coalition, right?
mm,
Between them.
Hmm.
Um, is that going to change? Are we seeing signs now that that's changing?
it was this really interesting dynamic where the federal Liberal Party was so like against EVs, but the New South Wales Liberal Party was like one of the more gold standard states on EVs for a while. It was this really interesting thing, but I definitely think that the Federal Labor Party is much more proactive on the shift to EVs. They have expressed interest in bringing in fuel efficiency standards. Oh well, they've said that they would be interested in hearing fuel efficiency standard submissions soon. Um,
The
and
business of
they
government was never fast.
No.
no, it wasn't. And they have discussed building out, nationwide charging networks, and they have discussed well, they're currently passing through adding EVs under a certain tax,
Hmm.
under a certain threshold to be exempt from the fringe benefits tax. So they are being much more proactive, but it's still, apart from the fuel efficiency standards, it's kind of this thing where it's still, we're just waiting for the really affordable one to at that critical mass, right?
So it's
The
a
thing
chicken and
is,
egg.
Mm.
uh, the thing is, though, I think, Adam, to get back to your point about whether or not combustion engine cars, if we're the only ones getting them, are going to get cheaper, I doubt that's going to happen. I don't have a crystal ball to say absolutely it won't. But when the rest of the world is shifting much more towards EVs, and especially when these bigger markets, when the EU is shifting there, when even in the US, where they love their gasoline, are shifting towards this and selling gajillions of the electric Ford truck and the Rivian and
Mm.
things like that, and especially where China is putting so much money and so much effort into producing EVs, and it's where a lot of these newer battery tech pieces are coming out of as well. We're going to be left behind not only with much dirtier cars, but fewer parts, less service, less support for it, using a diminishing resource. I can't see how, in classic market economics, that doesn't end up being more expensive just because it's harder to do.
So the
Yeah.
same way that it's more expensive to buy a foreign car at the moment because it's going to be harder to get parts, it'll just be more expensive to buy a petrol car because it's going to be harder to get parts.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, that's what the economics
That makes
suggest
sense.
should happen. Whether or not it does, of course, and the time frame, I think, is the critical thing. I guess the other thing that we're just talking politics that could make a big difference here, and I know some different state governments have looked into this a bit more, is a lot of them have started mandating this idea that they're going to buy for the government cars. They're going to mandate a certain number of EVs have to be bought. Now, Adam, you might think, well, that doesn't matter to me. I don't care if my MP is driving around in an electric car or not. But the point with that is they rotate those out every 2 to 3 years. They get new
Fleet
ones
cars.
because,
Yeah.
because the fleet has to appear new and shiny. At which point you've suddenly got this larger block of second-hand cars in the market, which become that bit more affordable. And then maybe 2 or 3 years after that, the next seller sells them. They've still perhaps got a reasonable city range on them at that point. So it's a market, I think, that can economically feed itself. It's just that we are so far behind where everyone else is. I look at the UK where the equivalent of my car you could buy for something around $10,000.
Yeah, we are playing catch up. The good news is that it probably wouldn't take that much to get us up to our peers, but yeah, it's a worry.
So, Zach, if we gave Charles the arse and made you El Presidente, what what would you do? What would be the number one thing? What would you do to help EVs make progress in Australia?
I think the appropriate thing to do would definitely to bring in fuel efficiency standards. It wouldn't necessarily be something that directly makes EVs more affordable for most people, but it gets the work started and it starts to phase out petrol vehicles at the core. And from that we would start to see EV versions, I guess, of the petrol cars that we've come to expect. We'd start to see these petrol cars phase to EVs. The difficult thing is that they would have to be really strong fuel efficiency standards so that there aren't any exclusion clauses that really let a petrol vehicle maker continue to make petrol vehicles quite a lot in the country. You know?
Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Zach for making time to join us this week.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
And Zach, it's your first time to face the patented, EV-friendly Vertical Hold 3 questions of doom. I will ask you all 3 questions at once. You can answer them in any order you'd like.
Okay.
Where can people find your work online? Where can they find you on social media? And our current big contentious question, what's the worst TV program you've ever watched?
People can find my work on Gizmodo Australia. People can find me online on Twitter. That's where I'm most active at Zachariah K _. And the worst TV show that I ever watched was probably a J.J. Abrams show called Revolution. It had no consistency. It was quite terrible.
And presumably lots and lots of lens flares, I'm guessing.
Lots and lots of lens flares, I think. I don't know. J.J. Abrams kind of blends to one, right?
And as always, you can catch us online at Vertical Hold AU on Twitter, at the Vertical Hold Facebook page, or at verticalhold.com.au.
And as always, thanks everyone for dropping by. Don't forget to tell your friends about us. Don't forget to leave us a message. Let us know what you think about EVs and help us spread the good word in 2022. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.